It's only going to get worse from here. So the stuff you see out there now is going to seem like a nice, stable, placid, good old days compared to what we see in the next decade. It's going to get much crazier from here as we continue to destroy the world's fiat currencies.
Are you tired of overpaying for your gold, silver, and platinum bullion coins and bars? Then visit sdbullion.com today. SD Bullion was recently named the 177th fastest growing company in the United States by Inc. magazine. This is because they offer the absolute lowest prices in the industry and follow up with over-the-top customer service. So what are you waiting for? Go to sdbullion.com today and join more than 60,000 happy investors that save money on every precious metals purchase they make.
Hey everyone, this is Elijah Johnson with silverdoctors.com, and back with us today is John Rubino from dollarcollapse.com. John, thank you so much for joining us today.
Hi, Elijah. Thanks for having me on.
All right. Now, I'd first like to discuss Catalonia. Now, the people voted to secede from Spain, even though Spain's highest court said the vote was unconstitutional. You know, there's been violence in the streets. What do you think about this situation? And do you think Catalonia will actually become fully independent?
Well, first of all, I think this is part of the pattern that began really years ago. As we've messed up our finances around the world by borrowing too much money and in effect, spending borrowed money, which brings future consumption into the present and lowers future consumption because of that, and makes the system harder to manage, which in turn leads to a lot of disgruntled people. You get messed up politics, and that's Brexit and President Trump and Marine Le Pen being very popular in France and the far-right party rising in the most recent election in Germany. And now Catalonia, it's all part of the same pattern of people being kind of disgusted with the central government under which they're living and therefore willing to try something new. And in Catalonia's case, that's a rich part of Spain that feels like it's been badly treated by the central government. It feels like it's having to pay for a lot of the consequences of bad central government policy that led to the financial crash in 2009 and really hasn't been cleaned up yet in Spain. They think they're better off alone. And they might well be. With technology being what it is today, the concept of the nation state is evolving. Because you can take a region like Catalonia, where most of the people get their internet results from Google. They do their searches over Google. They shop via Amazon.com. They might hitch a ride with Uber or something like that. What do you need the central government for if that's such a big part of your life? You can be a region and still be connected to the rest of the world as a smaller country. And that's the rationale for, first of all, Brexit. The British decided they can go it alone without being part of a big supernatural national organization. And Catalonia apparently feels the same way. Whether it turns out to be true or not, we'll see. It's going to work itself out over time as we try these experiments. But that's the rationale. People don't feel like the big systems work for them anymore. And because of that, they're willing to tear up the existing system and see what they can build in its place. And that's a direct result of financial mismanagement that goes back really to 1971 when we broke the final link between the world's fiat currencies and gold. That just set off borrowing and money printing and inflation that continues to this day. And since we're not doing anything to fix it, it's only going to get worse from here. So the stuff you see out there now is going to seem like a nice, stable, placid, good old days compared to what we see in the next decade. It's going to get much crazier from here as we continue to destroy the world's fiat currencies.
Now, you paralleled what's happening in Catalonia right now, with what happened with Brexit. And you were talking about how, when all the finances are messed up and, debt explodes, people are just trying to find something new, some different direction to take. What is your perspective? I know a lot of people have talked about it also, that it seems like there's this nationalist sentiment that's going on or anti-globalist sentiment that's going on. Do you think that has to do with it as well?
Oh, sure, because the multinational organizations have to a great extent defined the modern world. You know, the IMF and the World Bank and the UN. These are entities that have shaped the world that most people see when they look out their windows. And that world is not a happy place for a lot of people, for a growing number of people. You know, if you look at a lot of Trump voters in the U.S., for instance, these are, in a lot of cases, white men who used to have pretty good jobs in factories, but their jobs got shipped to China when the factory closed here and moved there, which is globalization, you know, which is part of the free trade process that's been going on for a long time. Maybe they feel like their neighborhoods are being overrun by people who haven't entered the country legally. And that's part of basically the open borders idea of multinationalism. And so the entities that have created the world that they see are not their friends in their own mind. So yeah, you know, it's easy to be opposed to globalism right now, because it seems to be hurting you if you're part of the 99%. You know, it's great for the 1%. If you have completely open borders and completely free trade, and you're a highly educated symbol manipulator, that just means the market for whatever you're selling is getting bigger and bigger, and the amount of money they're willing to pay you for what you do is going through the roof. You know, you make out. But the guys who used to work in factories, when those factories are closing, they don't make out. The people in neighborhoods that seem to be deteriorating really quickly, they don't make out. And those people outnumber the 1%. So in any kind of a fair election, going forward, actually over the past few years and going forward, the parties that used to be on the fringe are moving into the mainstream. You know, Trump never would have gotten elected a decade ago. And here he is, you know, winning a fairly decisive victory, at least in the Electoral College in the U.S. Marine Le Pen would never be the second most popular politician in France. And the right-wing party in Germany that just made these huge gains, they didn't make any gains in the past. They're making them now. And the reason for that is because things are getting worse for an awful lot of people. And those people have just given up on the experts. It's no longer a compliment to call someone an expert, because the experts are the guys who created this world. Therefore, in the eyes of a growing number of people, they are either corrupt or incompetent, or some combination of those two things. So mainstream media, for instance, in the US, is now almost as unpopular as Congress. And Congress is about as unpopular as used car salesmen, you know, and it goes on like that. The guys who used to be looked up to and to be viewed as the people that we trusted to take care of us and to make sure that things work the way they should are now the guys who broke the system. You know, they're the ones who we're mad at. And that is reflected in politics in a lot of different ways in a lot of different places, but it all has basically the same source. You know, these guys who are in charge presided over the biggest increase in debt that has ever happened in human history. And debt works the same way for a country as it does for an individual or a family, which is to say that if you borrow too much, your life spins out of control. And globally now, we're seeing the results of borrowing way too much, because things are spinning out of control almost wherever you look. You know, you can dig into the finances of Japan or China or Europe or the US, and along with a lot of other countries. And what you see is a huge mess. You know, it's astounding the numbers that we've been able to create and live with up to this point. You know, we've never seen debt to GDP anywhere near what it is right now. And the official debt numbers, which are gargantuan, don't include the biggest debts that are out there. You know, the unfunded liabilities of Social Security and Medicare in the US and the analogs to those programs in Europe and Japan are immense. They dwarf the size of the global economy. Those are bills that we have, checks that we've written, put it that way, that we're going to have to cash someday, but we have no way to cash them. You know, we have no way to take care of retiring baby boomers' health care and retirement around the world. We just can't do it. The numbers don't work. Yet we've promised to do that. So beyond just the money that the government owes, you've got these unfunded liabilities that are out there that are even bigger than what governments owe. And then you've got derivatives, which are these obscure financial instruments on the books of the big banks, which have a notional value of approaching $2 quadrillion right now. And when they blow up, they take the system down wholesale. That's just how it's going to work at some point. So we've done all this stuff. We've created this world that has all these huge crises waiting to happen. And when one of them happens, it'll cause all the other ones to blow up at the same time. And we're not getting anything for it. We don't have great jobs out there for everybody who wants one. And we don't have systems that deliver things to people in a really coherent, efficient way so that the people who are beneficiaries of whatever program we're talking about feel well taken care of. We don't have anything like that. We wasted that money, but we still have to pay it back. And that's the situation that we find ourselves in now. And the only way out of it is some kind of a big crisis. We've talked about this before, and your listeners are probably very familiar with the way you get out from under a lot of debt, which is to say you collapse under the weight of it, have a depression, or you inflate it away and destroy your currency. Either one has huge consequences for the people on the wrong side of it. So it's just a question of who we hurt going forward, because we don't have a choice of a painless way out of this where we just kind of muddle along until something happens and everything's better. That can't happen. That's absolutely impossible mathematically. So it won't happen.
No, you've talked about how, there's no solutions. One of the things that's in the news right now is, a tax reform, Trump's tax reform. But you've also talked about how really this doesn't matter. And you're saying that no public policy fix will really make a difference now.
Yeah, we're too far gone for any magic tax rate or magic interest rate to fix us. There is nothing left out there in the sphere of doable public policy that will help us deal with all this debt. The rationale for tax reform, which is false. I'll get to the real reason for tax reform in a second, but they say, oh, well, we'll make the system more efficient and we'll grow faster and we'll get out from under our debts by growing faster. No, you can't do that. You can grow marginally faster if you, for instance, cut taxes on capital. Then you get more people taking risks, more businesses starting and stuff like that. And it's a good thing, other things being equal. But politically, that's hard to the point of impossibility to do. In other words, give a big tax break to rich people. Yeah, good luck right now staying in office if you do that. And if you cut taxes in a way that actually puts more money in the hands of people, that means you lower what government is taking in, which raises government deficits, which means we have to borrow more. So that doesn't work either, because we can't cure excessive debt with more debt. But that's just the make-believe rationale for tax reform. What tax reform really is just a con for Congress to be able to extract more money from business. Basically, what they do every year, look at every congressional cycle. There is always somebody proposing tax reform. And what that does is it energizes all the people who benefit from big tax breaks right now, because they got to protect their tax break. Because it's worth, in a lot of cases, billions and billions of dollars to some of these really favored industries. So they go to Congress, they figure out who is going to be consequential in writing the next version of tax reform, and they buy them. They finance their next campaign. And congressmen and senators know this. They know that's how it works. So they basically extort money from the private sector by proposing tax reform year after year after year, and it never amounts to anything. The tax system gets more and more complex year after year, despite 5 or 6 rounds of tax reform just in the last couple of decades. So this time will be no different in that sense. What they're going to have to do if they want to lower tax rates is they need to close loopholes. So all the guys who get loopholes now are going to go to Congress and spend whatever it takes to keep those loopholes open. And in the end, tax rates won't fall. Loopholes will stay open. But a lot of congressmen will have really big campaign war chests going into the next election.
Now, another situation that you've paid close attention to is North Korea. This seems to be more a problem of, huge political conflict that could possibly lead to war. Just on Saturday, it was announced the Trump administration is now for the first time in direct communication with North Korea. Did you want to give our viewers an update on the North Korean situation?
Yeah, you have to go back a ways to understand North Korea because, we had a war in the 1950s in which North and South Korea, who were, client states of the first of the communists and the second of the West, fought with the U.S. and China both shooting at each other. It's the only time, to my knowledge, that we've ever actually shot at Chinese soldiers and had them shoot at American soldiers. But it ended in a stalemate. And the South went basically capitalist, and they're fairly rich. That's a fairly rich, free system. North went full-on Stalinist totalitarian and has never really recovered from it. They're incredibly poor by modern standards. And they're a brutal dictatorship run by crazy people who have made at least one rational decision, which is that they need nuclear weapons in order to avoid being invaded and taken over by the U.S. Because we do that when we can get away with it. If somebody annoys us, we send the CIA in to start a coup, or we just bomb them and then invade them. And these guys know that if they don't want to become Saddam Hussein, they need nuclear weapons. They need the ability to vaporize Los Angeles. And then maybe we'll treat them with respect. That's their rationale for what they're doing now. So for the past 20 or 30 years, they've been cutting deals with U.S. presidents in which they say, well, we'll do away with our nuclear program if you give us oil, or if you give us food, or if you do this or that. If you do something we want, we'll get rid of that nuclear program. And then they keep up with it in secret. And for some reason, we let them get away with that over and over again. But now they're at the point where it's public. They're not even trying to be secretive about it because they're there. They've got nuclear weapons and they've got delivery systems. Not good ones yet in either category, but they seem to do their thing. The bombs blow up and the missiles fly. And so it's just a matter of time before they can put a bomb on a missile that can reach something vital. And we're in the U.S. now faced with the dilemma. Do we stand back and let them get to the point where they literally have ICBMs that can hit Los Angeles or maybe even Washington, D.C.? The technology can progress to that point if it's allowed to. Or do we take them out right now at the risk of having them detonate some of those hydrogen bombs that they've got? And maybe, Seoul, the capital of South Korea, is 35 miles south of the North Korea border. So Seoul could be vaporized by North Korea before we could do much about that if we decide to invade them. And so that's what we're looking at now. It's a really, really tough decision because, you don't want to be the president who let North Korea get nuclear weapons, which they then subsequently use in some horrible way, right? But you also don't want to be the president that started a war that killed 30 million South Koreans. But that seems to be the only two choices that we have at this point and you got to, for any of today's problems, you've got to go back through the past and apportion a little bit of blame to those who came before. Our monetary problems go all the way back to Nixon. Our debt problems go back to Ronald Reagan. Well, our North Korea problem goes back to Bill Clinton, at least, because he cut some of these deals where, he thought he got something or he was just trying to kick the can down the road. But he didn't actually get anything. They kept on with the nuclear program, and here we are. So here we are with Donald Trump having to make this decision. And so he's basically having a Twitter war with the dictator of North Korea. And just this last week, his Secretary of State, Rex Tillerson, it came out, was in direct contact with the North Koreans. Which you would normally think is a good thing. You want to talk to your enemies as directly as possible to avoid misunderstanding, which might lead to something horrible, right? That's basic diplomacy 101. But Trump told Tillerson, don't bother. We'll take care of it some other way. And now you've got all this stuff about Tillerson calling Trump a moron and Trump getting ready to fire Tillerson and other people having to intervene to keep Tillerson in his job. It's not the kind of thing you want when you're in a really delicate geopolitical situation like this, but it's what we've got, As a previous Secretary of State or Secretary of Defense said, you go to war with the army you have, and so we're dealing with this problem with the government that we have right now. And it's ugly and scary because a miscalculation could easily lead to literally the worst loss of life in any war ever, since we've got nuclear weapons on both sides. So very scary time. And terrifying for anybody who's in the equity market, right? If you have a big stock portfolio and you're looking at a big geopolitical crisis on the horizon, you got to be sweating right now, because stocks are already wildly overvalued and would be expected based on history to have a bear market at some point pretty soon where they drop 30 or 40 or 50%. Even in normal times, stocks at this valuation level drop by a third to a half in subsequent bear markets. Well, add this overvaluation to geopolitical tensions that are kind of unique in a lot of ways, because we haven't had crazy people with nuclear weapons in the past. We've had bad people with nuclear weapons, but they turned out to be fairly rational in the end. The guys running the Soviet Union did not want to commit suicide, and they didn't. Guys running the U.S., for the most part, were relatively sane. But now it's not completely clear that we've got, full decks on either side. And so you should be very worried if you aren't set up in your finances with a crisis portfolio rather than a risk on, good times to the horizon portfolio. But unfortunately, most people have the latter. Most people are highly leveraged in equities and bonds that don't yield much of anything, which means they're incredibly risky too if interest rates spike in a crisis. So a very scary time, pretty much however you look at the world.
Definitely. And you're talking about how it's good to probably position oneself. Obviously, we can't give financial advice, but your opinion is, it seems like you're saying that you should probably position yourself to precious metals instead of, being in the stock market that is, as you're talking about, being very overvalued right now. As for gold and silver and precious metals, what is your perspective on why they're in the last couple weeks falling? They're at multi-week lows right now. It seems like with all, the geopolitical tension, they'd be going through the roof.
Yeah, normally they spike in this kind of situation, but there are a few reasons that gold isn't at $2,000 an ounce right now, all of them temporary. But one is that governments are actively depressing the price of gold. And, the techniques they use to do that are a little bit technical. I don't want to bore your listeners with it, but they have ways of dumping gold in the market and depressing the price. And another thing is the rise of cryptocurrencies, which serve in a lot of ways as the same function as gold. They give you a place to put your money that's outside the traditional banking system. And the increase in cryptocurrencies over the last couple of years have about equaled the amount of gold that's been produced by the world's gold mine. So it's quite a bit of cryptocurrency that has attracted money that might otherwise have gone into gold. One other reason for gold going down just in the last couple of weeks is that gold has these internal cycles, of which the commitment of traders report is an indicator that usually works really well for predicting what's going to happen in the next, 4 to 6 months or whatever. And right now, it's negative, which means gold should go down for another month or two and then bottom and then head back up. Those kind of squiggles don't really much matter in the long-term trend for gold, which is still up. Gold was $285 an ounce in 2000. So the fact that it's gone from $200 and some dollars to $1,200 and some dollars in a decade and a half means that the overall trend for gold is up, and it's going to continue to be up with some big squiggles, and some spikes when there's a crisis. So let us start bombing North Korea or something like that, and you'd see gold go back up to 2,000 in a heartbeat, I would think. But even if we solve the North Korea crisis and it goes to the back burner and we stop thinking about it, we still have the out of whack finances around the world which are leading governments to borrow more money year after year and create more currency year after year and encourage their private sector citizens to borrow ever more money. That's all leading to a lower value for the world's fiat currencies, which means gold will go up when measured in those fiat currencies. So the dollar value of gold is going to go up irregularly over time until we fix our monetary problems, which we aren't going to do anytime soon. There's no proposal on the table that would come even close to fixing our current problems. So gold and silver will tend to do well over time on average for probably the next decade and maybe more. You can't know what they're going to do in the next 6 months with any kind of accuracy, although the Commitment of Traders report has over the past decade or two given a pretty good indication of the general trend. And as I said, it says negative for another month or two, and then a bottoming, and then positive. So gold, which has been trending upward irregularly since it was below 1,000 a year or so ago, is probably going to continue to trend irregularly upward, which means 1,300 maybe in the next mini cycle will be the bottom instead of the top, and it'll go to 1,400. And that's good if you own it, because it's much better than owning fiat currencies, which are going down steadily against all real stuff. And it's very good if you own high-quality mining stocks, because they're kind of leveraged to the price of gold and silver. They go up more and down more than the price of the underlying metals. So if the irregular trend of gold and silver will be up going forward, then the irregular trend of mining stocks will be up, but more dramatically. So I think now is a very good time to be adding to a portfolio of companies like gold miners that own real things, as opposed to, say, bank stocks, which represent financial assets, which can just vaporize. Gold stored in a safe place is still going to be there and still going to be valuable 100 years from now. Government bonds in a bank portfolio may just evaporate. They may cease to exist, or they may drop in value by 70% and never recover over the next cycle. So you don't want to own stocks of companies like banks that tend to own make-believe assets like bonds and derivatives. And you do want to own the stocks of companies that own real assets like solar farms and possibly oil wells, at least for a little while longer, and gold and silver and farmland and well-chosen real estate. There's a lot of real stuff out there that you can own a piece of via the stock market, and that will probably rise in value over time.
All right. Well, John Rubino, thank you so much for joining us today. Before we let you go, did you want to share with the viewers any last thoughts you had and where they can find you online if they're interested in learning more?
Oh, I have too many final thoughts. This is a crazy world, Elijah. There's enough to keep you going all day long, just thinking and talking about all the problems that we have right now. So I'll leave you with that thought. And I run dollarcollapse.com, which is a continuously updated website that covers a lot of this stuff and offers some investment advice at the same time for steering you away from financial assets and towards real assets.
All right. Once again, thank you so much for joining us today, John.
Thanks, Elijah.